Matthew Arnold. On the modern element in literature. What follows was delivered as an inaugural lecture in the Poetry Chair at Oxford. It was never printed, but there appeared at the time several comments on it from critics who had either heard it, or heard reports about it. It was meant to be followed and completed by a course of lectures developing the subject entirely, and some of these were given. But the course was broken off because I found my knowledge insufficient for treating in a solid way many portions of the subject chosen. The inaugural lecture, however, treating a portion of the subject where my knowledge was perhaps less insufficient, and where besides my hearers were better able to help themselves out from their own knowledge, is here printed. No one feels the imperfection of this sketchy and generalizing mode of treatment more than I do, and not only is this mode of treatment less to my taste now than it was 11 years ago, but the style too, which is that of the doctor rather than the explorer, is a style which I have long since learned to abandon. Nevertheless, having written much of late about Hellenism and Hebraism, and Hellenism being to many people almost an empty name compared with Hebraism, I print this lecture with the hope that it may serve, in the absence of other and fuller illustrations, to give some notion of the Hellenic spirit and its works, and of their significance in the history of the evolution of the human spirit in general. M.A. It is related in one of those legends which illustrate the history of Buddhism, that a certain disciple once presented himself before his master, Buddha, with the desire to be permitted to undertake a mission of peculiar difficulty. The compassionate teacher represented to him the obstacles to be surmounted and the risks to be run. Purna, so the disciple was called, insisted, and replied, with equal humility and adroitness, to the successive objections of his advisor. Satisfied at last by his answers of the fitness of his disciple, Buddha accorded to him the desired permission, and dismissed him to his task with these remarkable words, nearly identical with those in which he himself is said to have been admonished by a divinity at the outset of his own career. Go then, O Purna, are his words, having been delivered, deliver, having been consoled, console, being arrived thyself at the farther bank, enable others to arrive there also. It was a moral deliverance, eminently, of which the great Oriental reformer spoke. It was a deliverance from the pride, the sloth, the anger, the selfishness, which impair the moral activity of man, a deliverance which is demanded of all individuals and in all ages. But there is another deliverance for the human race, hardly less important, indeed, than the first, for in the enjoyment of both united consists man's true freedom, but demanded far less universally, and even more rarely and imperfectly obtained, a deliverance neglected, apparently hardly conceived, in some ages, while it has been pursued with earnestness in others, which derive from that very pursuit their peculiar character. This deliverance is an intellectual deliverance. An intellectual deliverance is the peculiar demand of those ages which are called modern, and those nations are said to be imbued with the modern spirit most eminently, in which the demand for such a deliverance has been made with most zeal, and satisfied with most completeness. Such a deliverance is emphatically, whether we will or no, the demand of the age in which we ourselves live. All intellectual pursuits our age judges according to their power of helping to satisfy this demand. Of all studies it asks, above all, the question, how far they can contribute to this deliverance. I propose, on this my first occasion of speaking here, to attempt such a general survey of ancient classical literature and history as may afford us the conviction in presence of the doubt so often expressed of the profitableness, in the present day, of our study of this literature, that, even admitting to their fullest extent the legitimate demands of our age, the literature of ancient Greece is, even for modern times, a mighty agent of intellectual deliverance, even for modern times. Therefore, an object of indestructible interest. But first let us ask ourselves why the demand for an intellectual deliverance arises in such an age as the present, and in what the deliverance itself consists. The demand arises, because our present age has around it a copious and complex present, and behind it a copious and complex past. It arises, because the present age exhibits to the individual man who contemplates it the spectacle of a vast multitude of facts awaiting and inviting his comprehension. The deliverance consists in man's comprehension of this present and past. It begins when our mind begins to enter into possession of the general ideas which are the law of this vast multitude of facts. It is perfect when we have acquired that harmonious acquiescence of mind which we feel in contemplating a grand spectacle that is intelligible to us, when we have lost that impatient irritation of mind which we feel in presence of an immense, moving, confused spectacle which, while it perpetually excites our curiosity, perpetually baffles our comprehension. This, then, is what distinguishes certain epochs in the history of the human race, and our own amongst the number. On the one hand, the presence of a significant spectacle to contemplate, on the other hand, the desire to find the true point of view from which to contemplate this spectacle. He who has found that point of view, he who adequately comprehends this spectacle, has risen to the comprehension of his age. He who communicates that point of view to his age, he who interprets to it that spectacle, is one of his age's intellectual deliverers. The spectacle, the facts, presented for the comprehension of the present age, are indeed immense. The facts consist of the events, the institutions, the sciences, the arts, the literatures, in which human life has manifested itself up to the present time. The spectacle is the collective life of humanity. And everywhere there is connection, everywhere there is illustration, no single event, no single literature, is adequately comprehended except in its relation to other events, to other literatures. The literature of ancient Greece, the literature of the Christian Middle Age, so long as they are regarded as two isolated literatures, two isolated growths of the human spirit, are not adequately comprehended, and it is adequate comprehension which is the demand of the present age. We must compare, the illustrious Chancellor of Cambridge said the other day to his hearers at Manchester. We must compare the works of other ages with those of our own age and country, that, while we feel proud of the immense development of knowledge and power of production which we possess, we may learn humility in contemplating the refinement of feeling and intensity of thought manifested in the works of the older schools. To know how others stand, that we may know how we ourselves stand, and to know how we ourselves stand, that we may correct our mistakes and achieve our deliverance, that is our problem. But all facts, all the elements of the spectacle before us, have not an equal value, do not merit alike attention, and it is well that they do not, for no man would be adequate to the task of thoroughly mastering them all. Some have more significance for us, others have less, some merit our utmost attention in all their details, others it is sufficient to comprehend in their general character, and then they may be dismissed. What facts, then, let us ask ourselves, what elements of the spectacle before us, will naturally be most interesting to a highly developed age like our own, to an age making the demand which we have described for an intellectual deliverance by means of the complete intelligence of its own situation? Evidently, the other age is similarly developed, and making the same demand. And what past literature will naturally be most interesting to such an age as our own? Evidently, the literatures which have most successfully solved for their ages the problem which occupies ours, the literatures which in their day and for their own nation have adequately comprehended, have adequately represented, the spectacle before them. A significant, a highly developed, a culminating epoch, on the one hand a comprehensive, a commensurate, an adequate literature, on the other these will naturally be the objects of deepest interest to our modern age. Such an epoch and such a literature are, in fact, modern, in the same sense in which our own age and literature are modern, they are founded upon a rich past and upon an instructive fullness of experience. It may, however, happen that a great epoch is without a perfectly adequate literature. It may happen that a great age, a great nation, has attained a remarkable fullness of political and social development, without intellectually taking the complete measure of itself, without adequately representing that development in its literature. In this case, the epoch, the nation itself, will still be an object of the greatest interest to us, but the literature will be an object of less interest to us. The facts, the material spectacle, are there, but the contemporary view of the facts, the intellectual interpretation, are inferior and inadequate. It may happen, on the other hand, that great authors, that a powerful literature, are found in an age and nation less great and powerful than themselves. It may happen that a literature, that a man of genius, may arise adequate to the representation of a greater, a more highly developed age than that in which they appear. It may happen that a literature completely interprets its epoch, and yet has something over, that it has a force, a richness, a geniality, a power of view which the materials at its disposition are insufficient adequately to employ. In such a case, the literature will be more interesting to us than the epoch. The interpreting power, the illuminating and revealing intellect, are there, but the spectacle on which they throw their light is not fully worthy of them. And I shall not, I hope, be thought to magnify too much my office if I add, that it is to the poetical literature of an age that we must, in general, look for the most perfect, the most adequate interpretation of that age for the performance of a work which demands the most energetic and harmonious activity of all the powers of the human mind. Because that activity of the whole mind, that genius, as Johnson nobly describes it, without which judgment is cold and knowledge is inert, that energy which collects, combines, amplifies, and animates, is in poetry at its highest stretch and in its most energetic exertion. What we seek, therefore, what will most enlighten us, most contribute to our intellectual deliverance, is the union of two things. It is the coexistence, the simultaneous appearance, of a great epoch and a great literature. Now the culminating age in the life of ancient Greece I call, beyond question, a great epoch. The life of Athens in the 5th century before our era I call one of the highly developed, one of the marking, one of the modern periods in the life of the whole human race. It has been said that the Athens of Pericles was a vigorous man, at the summit of his bodily strength and mental energy. There was the utmost energy of life there, public and private, the most entire freedom, the most unprejudiced and intelligent observation of human affairs. Let us rapidly examine some of the characteristics which distinguish modern epochs. Let us see how far the culminating century of ancient Greece exhibits them. Let us compare it, in respect of them, with a much later, a celebrated century. Let us compare it with the age of Elizabeth in our own country. To begin with what is exterior. One of the most characteristic outward features of a modern age, of an age of advanced civilization, is the banishment of the ensigns of war and bloodshed from the intercourse of civil life. Crime still exists, and wars are still carried on, but within the limits of civil life a circle has been formed within which man can move securely, and develop the arts of peace uninterruptedly. The private man does not go forth to his daily occupation prepared to assail the life of his neighbor or to have to defend his own. With the disappearance of the constant means of offense the occasions of offense diminish, society at last acquires repose, confidence, and free activity. An important inward characteristic, again, is the growth of a tolerant spirit, that spirit which is the offspring of an enlarged knowledge, a spirit patient of the diversities of habits and opinions. Other characteristics are the multiplication of the conveniences of life, the formation of taste, the capacity for refined pursuits. And this leads us to the supreme characteristic of all, the intellectual maturity of man himself, the tendency to observe facts with a critical spirit, to search for their law, not to wander among them at random, to judge by the rule of reason, not by the impulse of prejudice or caprice. Well, now, with respect to the presence of all these characteristics in the age of Pericles, we possess the explicit testimony of an immortal work of the history of Thucydides. The Athenians first, he says, speaking of the gradual development of Grecian society up to the period when the Peloponnesian War commenced, the Athenians first left off the habit of wearing arms, that is, this mark of superior civilization had, in the age of Pericles, become general in Greece, had long been visible at Athens. In the time of Elizabeth, on the other hand, the wearing of arms was universal in England and throughout Europe. Again, the conveniences, the ornaments, the luxuries of life, had become common at Athens at the time of which we are speaking. But there had been an advance even beyond this, there had been an advance to that perfection, that propriety of taste which proscribes the excess of ornament, the extravagance of luxury. The Athenians had given up, Thucydides says, had given up, although not very long before, an extravagance of dress and an excess of personal ornament which, in the first flush of newly discovered luxury, had been adopted by some of the richer classes. The height of civilization in this respect seems to have been attained. There was general elegance and refinement of life, and there was simplicity. What was the case in this respect in the Elizabethan age? The scholar Casaubon, who settled in England in the reign of James I, bears evidence to the want here, even at that time, of conveniences of life which were already to be met with on the continent of Europe. On the other hand, the taste for fantastic, for excessive personal adornment, to which the portraits of the time bear testimony, is admirably set forth in the work of a great novelist, who was also a very truthful antiquarian in the Kenilworth of Sir Walter Scott. We all remember the description, in the 13th and 14th chapters of the second volume of Kenilworth, of the barbarous magnificence, the fierce vanities, of the dress of the period. Pericles praises the Athenians that they had discovered sources of recreation for the spirit to counterbalance the labors of the body. Compare the pleasures which charmed the whole body of the Athenian people through the yearly round of their festivals with the popular shows and pastimes in Kenilworth. We have freedom, says Pericles, for individual diversities of opinion and character. We do not take offense at the tastes and habits of our neighbor if they differ from our own. Yes, in Greece, in the Athens of Pericles, there is toleration, but in England, in the England of the 16th century, the Puritans are then in full growth. So that with regard to these characteristics of civilization of a modern spirit which we have hitherto enumerated, the superiority, it will be admitted, rests with the age of Pericles. Let us pass to what we said was the supreme characteristic of a highly developed, a modern age, the manifestation of a critical spirit, the endeavor after a rational arrangement and appreciation of facts. Let us consider one or two of the passages in the masterly introduction which Thucydides, the contemporary of Pericles, has prefixed to his history. What was his motive in choosing the Peloponnesian War for his subject? Because it was, in his opinion, the most important, the most instructive event which had, up to that time, happened in the history of mankind. What is his effort in the first 23 chapters of his history? To place in their correct point of view all the facts which had brought Grecian society to the point at which that dominant event found it, to strip these facts of their exaggeration, to examine them critically. The enterprises undertaken in the early times of Greece were on a much smaller scale than had been commonly supposed. The Greek chiefs were induced to combine in the expedition against Troy, not by their respect for an oath taken by them all when suitors to Helen, but by their respect for the preponderating influence of Agamemnon. The siege of Troy had been protracted not so much by the valor of the besieged as by the inadequate mode of warfare necessitated by the want of funds of the besiegers. No doubt Thucydides' criticism of the Trojan War is not perfect, but observe how in these and many other points he labors to correct popular errors, to assign their true character to facts, complaining, as he does so, of men's habit of uncritical reception of current stories. So little a matter of care to most men, he says, is the search after truth, and so inclined are they to take up any story which is ready to their hand. He himself, he continues, has endeavored to give a true picture, and believes that in the main he has done so. For some readers his history may want the charm of the uncritical, half-fabulous narratives of earlier writers, but for such as desire to gain a clear knowledge of the past, and thereby of the future also, which will surely, after the course of human things, represent again hereafter, if not the very image, yet the near resemblance of the past, if such shall judge my work to be profitable, I shall be well content. What language shall we properly call this? It is modern language, it is the language of a thoughtful philosophic man of our own days, it is the language of Burke or Niebuhr assigning the true aim of history. And yet Thucydides is no mere literary man, no isolated thinker, speaking far over the heads of his hearers to a future age. No, he was a man of action, a man of the world, a man of his time. He represents, at its best indeed, but he represents, the general intelligence of his age and nation, of a nation the meanest citizens of which could follow with comprehension the profoundly thoughtful speeches of Pericles. Let us now turn for a contrast to a historian of the Elizabethan age, also a man of great mark and ability, also a man of action, also a man of the world, Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh writes the history of the world, as Thucydides has written the history of the Peloponnesian War. Let us hear his language, let us mark his point of view, let us see what problems occur to him for solution. Seeing, he says, that we digress in all the ways of our lives, seeing the life of man is nothing else but digression, I may be the better excused in writing their lives and actions. What are the preliminary facts which he discusses, as Thucydides discusses the Trojan War and the early naval power of Crete, and which are to lead up to his main inquiry? Open the table of contents of his first volume. You will find, of the firmament, and of the waters above the firmament, and whether there be any crystal in heaven, or any prima mobile. You will then find of fate, and that the stars have great influence, and that their operations may diversely be prevented or furthered. Then you come to 2 entire chapters on the place of paradise, and on the 2 chief trees in the garden of paradise. And in what style, with what power of criticism, does Raleigh treat the subjects so selected? I turn to the 7th section of the 3rd chapter of his first book, which treats of their opinion which make paradise as high as the moon, and of others which make it higher than the middle region of the air. Thus he begins the discussion of this opinion. Whereas Beta saith, and as the schoolmen affirm paradise to be a place altogether removed from the knowledge of men, locus a cognition hominum remotissimus, and Barcephus conceived that paradise was far in the east, but mounted above the ocean and all the earth, and near the orb of the moon, which opinion, though the schoolmen charge Beta withal, yet Pierius lays it off from Beta upon Strabus and his master Rabanus, and whereas Rupertus in his geography of paradise doth not much differ from the rest, but finds it seated next or nearest heaven. So he states the error, and now for his own criticism of it. First, such a place cannot be commodious to live in, for being so near the moon it had been too near the sun and other heavenly bodies. Secondly, it must have been too joint a neighbor to the element of fire. Thirdly, the air in that region is so violently moved and carried about with such swiftness as nothing in that place can consist or have abiding. Fourthly, but what has been quoted is surely enough, and there is no use in continuing. Which is the ancient here, and which is the modern? Which uses the language of an intelligent man of our own days? Which a language wholly obsolete and unfamiliar to us? Which has the rational appreciation and control of his facts? Which wanders among them helplessly and without a clue? Is it our own countryman, or is it the Greek? And the language of Raleigh affords a fair sample of the critical power, of the point of view, possessed by the majority of intelligent men of his day, as the language of Thucydides affords us a fair sample of the critical power of the majority of intelligent men in the age of Pericles. Well, then, in the age of Pericles we have, in spite of its antiquity, a highly developed, a modern, a deeply interesting epoch. Next comes the question, is this epoch adequately interpreted by its highest literature? Now, the peculiar characteristic of the highest literature, the poetry of the 5th century in Greece before the Christian era, is its adequacy. The peculiar characteristic of the poetry of Sophocles is its consummate, its unrivaled adequacy, that it represents the highly developed human nature of that age, human nature developed in a number of directions, politically, socially, religiously, morally developed in its completest and most harmonious development in all these directions. While there is shed over this poetry the charm of that noble serenity which always accompanies true insight. If in the body of Athenians of that time there was, as we have said, the utmost energy of mature manhood, public and private, the most entire freedom, the most unprejudiced and intelligent observation of human affairs, in Sophocles there is the same energy, the same maturity, the same freedom, the same intelligent observation, but all these idealized and glorified by the grace and light shed over them from the noblest poetical feeling. And therefore I have ventured to say of Sophocles, that he saw life steadily, and saw it whole. Well may we understand how Pericles, how the great statesman whose aim was, it has been said, to realize in Athens the idea which he had conceived of human greatness, and who partly succeeded in his aim, should have been drawn to the great poet whose works are the noblest reflection of his success. I assert, therefore, though the detailed proof of the assertion must be reserved for other opportunities, that, if the 5th century in Greece before our era is a significant and modern epoch, the poetry of that epoch, the poetry of Pindar, Aeschylus, and Sophocles is an adequate representation and interpretation of it. The poetry of Aristophanes is an adequate representation of it also. True, this poetry regards humanity from the comic side, but there is a comic side from which to regard humanity as well as a tragic one, and the distinction of Aristophanes is to have regarded it from the true point of view on the comic side. He too, like Sophocles, regards the human nature of his time in its fullest development. The boldest creations of a riotous imagination are in Aristophanes, as has been justly said, based always upon the foundation of a serious thought. Politics, education, social life, literature, all the great modes in which the human life of his day manifested itself are the subjects of his thoughts, and of his penetrating comment. There is shed, therefore, over his poetry the charm, the vital freshness, which is felt when man and his relations are from any side adequately, and therefore genially, regarded. Here is the true difference between Aristophanes and Menander. There has been preserved an epitome of a comparison by Plutarch between Aristophanes and Menander, in which the grossness of the former, the exquisite truth to life and felicity of observation of the latter, are strongly insisted upon, and the preference of the refined, the learned, the intelligent men of a later period for Menander loudly proclaimed. What should take a man of refinement to the theatre, asks Plutarch, except to see one of Menander's plays? When do you see the theatre filled with cultivated persons, except when Menander is acted? And he is the favorite refreshment, he continues, to the overstrained mind of the laborious philosopher. And everyone knows the famous line of tribute to this poet by an enthusiastic admirer in antiquity, O life and Menander, which of you painted the other? We remember, too, how a great English statesman is said to have declared that there was no lost work of antiquity which he so ardently desired to recover as a play of Menander. Yet Menander has perished, and Aristophanes has survived. And to what is this to be attributed? To the instinct of self-preservation in humanity. The human race has the strongest, the most invincible tendency to live, to develop itself. It retains, it clings to what fosters its life, what favors its development, to the literature which exhibits it in its vigor. It rejects, it abandons what does not foster its development, the literature which exhibits it arrested and decayed. Now, between the times of Sophocles and Menander a great check had befallen the development of Greece, the failure of the Athenian expedition to Syracuse, and the consequent termination of the Peloponnesian War in a result unfavorable to Athens. The free expansion of her growth was checked. One of the noblest channels of Athenian life, that of political activity, had begun to narrow and to dry up. That was the true catastrophe of the ancient world. It was then that the oracles of the ancient world should have become silent, and that its gods should have forsaken their temples, for from that date the intellectual and spiritual life of Greece was left without an adequate material basis of political and practical life, and both began inevitably to decay. The opportunity of the ancient world was then lost, never to return, for neither the Macedonian nor the Roman world, which possessed an adequate material basis, possessed, like the Athens of earlier times, an adequate intellect and soul to inform and inspire them, and there was left of the ancient world, when Christianity arrived, of Greece only a head without a body, and of Rome only a body without a soul. It is Athens after this check, after this diminution of vitality, it is man with part of his life shorn away, refined and intelligent indeed, but sceptical, frivolous, and dissolute, which the poetry of Menander represented. The cultivated, the accomplished might applaud the dexterity, the perfection of the representation might prefer it to the free genial delineation of a more living time with which they were no longer in sympathy. But the instinct of humanity taught it, that in the one poetry there was the seed of life, in the other poetry the seed of death, and it has rescued Aristophanes, while it has left Menander to his fate. In the flowering period of the life of Greece, therefore, we have a culminating age, one of the flowering periods of the life of the human race. In the poetry of that age we have a literature commensurate with its epoch. It is most perfectly commensurate in the poetry of Pindar, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Aristophanes. These, therefore, will be the supremely interesting objects in this literature, but the stages in literature which led up to this point of perfection, the stages in literature which led downward from it, will be deeply interesting also. A distinguished person, who has lately been occupying himself with Homer, has remarked that an undue preference is given, in the studies of Oxford, to these poets over Homer. The justification of such a preference, even if we put aside all philological considerations, lies, perhaps, in what I have said. Homer himself is eternally interesting, he is a greater poetical power than even Sophocles or Aeschylus, but his age is less interesting than himself. Aeschylus and Sophocles represent an age as interesting as themselves. The names, indeed, in their dramas are the names of the old heroic world, from which they were far separated, but these names are taken, because the use of them permits to the poet that free and ideal treatment of his characters which the highest tragedy demands, and into these figures of the old world is poured all the fullness of life and of thought which the new world had accumulated. This new world in its maturity of reason resembles our own, and the advantage over Homer in their greater significance for us, which Aeschylus and Sophocles gain by belonging to this new world, more than compensates for their poetical inferiority to him. Let us now pass to the Roman world. There is no necessity to accumulate proofs that the culminating period of Roman history is to be classed among the leading, the significant, the modern periods of the world. There is universally current, I think, a pretty correct appreciation of the high development of the Rome of Cicero and Augustus. No one doubts that material civilization and the refinements of life were largely diffused in it. No one doubts that cultivation of mind and intelligence were widely diffused in it. Therefore, I will not occupy time by showing that Cicero corresponded with his friends in the style of the most accomplished, the most easy letter writers of modern times, that Caesar did not write history like Sir Walter Raleigh. The great period of Rome is, perhaps, on the whole, the greatest, the fullest, the most significant period on record. It is certainly a greater, a fuller period than the age of Pericles. It is an infinitely larger school for the men reared in it. The relations of life are immeasurably multiplied, the events which happen are on an immeasurably grander scale. The facts, the spectacle of this Roman world, then, are immense. Let us see how far the literature, the interpretation of the facts, has been adequate. Let us begin with a great poet, a great philosopher, Lucretius. In the case of Thucydides I called attention to the fact that his habit of mind, his mode of dealing with questions, were modern, that they were those of an enlightened, reflecting man among ourselves. Let me call attention to the exhibition in Lucretius of a modern feeling not less remarkable than the modern thought in Thucydides. The predominance of thought, of reflection, in modern epochs is not without its penalties. In the unsound, in the overtasked, in the oversensitive, it has produced the most painful, the most lamentable results. It has produced a state of feeling unknown to less enlightened but perhaps healthier epochs, a feeling of depression, the feeling of ennui. Depression and ennui, these are the characteristics stamped on how many of the representative works of modern times. They are also the characteristics stamped on the poem of Lucretius. One of the most powerful, the most solemn passages of the work of Lucretius, one of the most powerful, the most solemn passages in the literature of the whole world, is the well-known conclusion of the third book. With masterly touches he exhibits the lassitude, the incurable tedium which pursue men in their amusements. With indignant irony he upbraids them for the cowardice with which they cling to a life which for most is miserable, to a life which contains, for the most fortunate, nothing but the old dull round of the same unsatisfying objects forever presented. A man rushes abroad, he says, because he is sick of being at home, and suddenly comes home again because he finds himself no whit easier abroad. He posts as fast as his horses can take him to his country seat. When he has got there he hesitates what to do, or he throws himself down moodily to sleep, and seeks forgetfulness in that, or he makes the best of his way back to town again with the same speed as he fled from it. Thus everyone flies from himself. What a picture of ennui! Of the disease of the most modern societies, the most advanced civilizations. Oh man, he exclaims again. The lights of the world, Scipio, Homer, Epicurus, are dead. Wilt thou hesitate and fret at dying, whose life is well nigh dead whilst thou art yet alive, who consumest in sleep the greater part of thy span, and when awake dronest and ceasest not to dream, and carriest about a mind troubled with baseless fear, and canst not find what it is that aileth thee when thou staggerest like a drunken wretch in the press of thy cares, and welterest hither and thither in the unsteady wandering of thy spirit? And again, I have nothing more than you have already seen. He makes nature say to man, to invent for your amusement, idem sunt omnia semper, all things continue the same forever. Yes, Lucretius is modern, but is he adequate? And how can a man adequately interpret the activity of his age when he is not in sympathy with it? Think of the varied, the abundant, the wide spectacle of the Roman life of his day. Think of its fullness of occupation, its energy of effort. From these Lucretius withdraws himself, and bids his disciples to withdraw themselves. He bids them to leave the business of the world, and to apply themselves not rerum conditio rerum to learn the nature of things. But there is no peace, no cheerfulness for him either in the world from which he comes, or in the solitude to which he goes. With stern effort, with gloomy despair, he seems to rivet his eyes on the elementary reality, the naked framework of the world, because the world in its fullness and movement is too exciting a spectacle for his discomposed brain. He seems to feel the spectacle of it at once terrifying and alluring, and to deliver himself from it he has to keep perpetually repeating his formula of disenchantment and annihilation. In reading him, you understand the tradition which represents him as having been driven mad by a poison administered as a love charm by his mistress, and as having composed his great work in the intervals of his madness. Lucretius is, therefore, overstrained, gloom-weighted, morbid, and he who is morbid is no adequate interpreter of his age. I pass to Virgil, to the poetical name which of all poetical names has perhaps had the most prodigious fortune, the name which for Dante, for the Middle Age, represented the perfection of classical antiquity. The perfection of classical antiquity Virgil does not represent, but far be it from me to add my voice to those which have decried his genius. Nothing that I shall say is, or can ever be, inconsistent with the profound, and almost affectionate veneration for him. But with respect to him, as with respect to Lucretius, I shall freely ask the question, is he adequate? Does he represent the epoch in which he lived, the mighty Roman world of his time, as the great poets of the great epoch of Greek life represented theirs, in all its fullness, in all its significance? From the very form itself of his great poem, the Aeneid, one would be led to augur that this was impossible. The epic form, as a form for representing contemporary or nearly contemporary events, has attained, in the poems of Homer, an unmatched, an immortal success. The epic form as employed by learned poets for the reproduction of the events of a past age has attained a very considerable success. But for this purpose, for the poetic treatment of the events of a past age, the epic form is a less vital form than the dramatic form. The great poets of the modern period of Greece are accordingly, as we have seen, the dramatic poets. The chief of these Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes have survived. The distinguished epic poets of the same period Paneasis, Coerulus, Antimachus though praised by the Alexandrian critics, have perished in a common destruction with the undistinguished. And what is the reason of this? It is, that the dramatic form exhibits, above all, the actions of man as strictly determined by his thoughts and feelings. It exhibits, therefore, what may be always accessible, always intelligible, always interesting. But the epic form takes a wider range. It represents not only the thought and passion of man, that which is universal and eternal, but also the forms of outward life, the fashion of manners, the aspects of nature, that which is local or transient. To exhibit adequately what is local and transient, only a witness, a contemporary, can suffice. In the reconstruction, by learning and antiquarian ingenuity, of the local and transient features of a past age, in their representation by one who is not a witness or contemporary, it is impossible to feel the liveliest kind of interest. What, for instance, is the most interesting portion of the Aeneid, the portion where Virgil seems to be moving most freely, and therefore to be most animated, most forcible? Precisely that portion which has most a dramatic character, the episode of Dido, that portion where locality and matters are nothing, where persons and characters are everything. We might presume beforehand, therefore, that if Virgil, at a time when contemporary epic poetry was no longer possible, had been inspired to represent human life in its fullest significance, he would not have selected the epic form. Accordingly, what is, in fact, the character of the poem, the frame of mind of the poet? Has the poem the depth, the completeness of the poems of Aeschylus or Sophocles, of those adequate and consummate representations of human life? Has the poet the serious cheerfulness of Sophocles, of a man who has mastered the problem of human life, who knows its gravity, and is therefore serious, but who knows that he comprehends it, and is therefore cheerful? Over the whole of the great poem of Virgil, over the whole Aeneid, there rests an ineffable melancholy, not a rigid, a moody gloom, like the melancholy of Lucretius. No, a sweet, a touching sadness, but still a sadness, a melancholy which is at once a source of charm in the poem, and a testimony to its incompleteness. Virgil, as Niebuhr has well said, expressed no affected self-disparagement, but the haunting, the irresistible self-dissatisfaction of his heart, when he desired on his deathbed that his poem might be destroyed. A man of the most delicate genius, the most rich learning, but of weak health, of the most sensitive nature, in a great and overwhelming world, conscious, at heart, of his inadequacy for the thorough spiritual mastery of that world and its interpretation in a work of art, conscious of this inadequacy, the one weak place in the mighty Roman nature. This suffering, this graceful-minded, this finely gifted man is the most beautiful, the most attractive figure in literary history, but he is not the adequate interpreter of the great period of Rome. We come to Horace, and if Lucretius, if Virgil want cheerfulness, Horace wants seriousness. I go back to what I said of Menander, as with Menander so it is with Horace, the men of taste, the men of cultivation, the men of the world are enchanted with him. He has not a prejudice, not an illusion, not a blunder. True. Yet the best men in the best ages have never been thoroughly satisfied with Horace. If human life were complete without faith, without enthusiasm, without energy, Horace, like Menander, would be the perfect interpreter of human life, but it is not, to the best, to the most living sense of humanity, it is not, and because it is not, Horace is inadequate. Pedants are tiresome, men of reflection and enthusiasm are unhappy and morbid, therefore Horace is a sceptical man of the world. Men of action are without ideas, men of the world are frivolous and sceptical, therefore Lucretius is plunged in gloom and in stern sorrow. So hard, nay, so impossible for most men is it to develop themselves in their entireness, to rejoice in the variety, the movement of human life with the children of the world, to be serious over the depth, the significance of human life with the wise. Horace warms himself before the transient fire of human animation and human pleasure while he can, and is only serious when he reflects that the fire must soon go out. Damnatamen celeris reparant coelesce geluni, nos, ubidicidimus. For nature there is renovation, but for man there is none. It is exquisite, but it is not interpretative and fortifying. In the Roman world, then, we have found a highly modern, a deeply significant, an interesting period, a period more significant and more interesting, because fuller, than the great period of Greece, but we have not a commensurate literature. In Greece we have seen a highly modern, a most significant and interesting period, although on a scale of less magnitude and importance than the great period of Rome, but then, coexisting with the great epic of Greece there is what is wanting to that of Rome, a commensurate, an interesting literature. The intellectual history of our race cannot be clearly understood without applying to other ages, nations, and literatures the same method of inquiry which we have been here imperfectly applying to what is called classical antiquity. But enough has at least been said, perhaps, to establish the absolute, the enduring interest of Greek literature, and, above all, of Greek poetry.